Hey, Henry, how are you? Good to see you.
Rumors of my death were premature.
Good. Well, good morning. Last Sunday we took a look at the 10 words, the 10 commandments. And so this morning I want us to walk through what's called the Book of the Covenant, which is Exodus 20:22 to 23:33. It's actually referred to as the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 24:7. This is the thing that Moses is going to read, and it'll in effect be Israel's marriage vow, if you will. Now, we obviously don't have time to look at everything in the Book of the Covenant, but I want to take a look at a few things to give you a sort of an idea of what the Book of the Covenant is about. And before I do that, I'll kind of issue a caution. Sometimes what happens to people, I know that it never happens to any of you because you're also spiritually advanced and educated, but some people open the Old Testament and one of two things happens. They'll start reading the legal portions and they'll find them dull and boring, or they'll start reading the legal portions and they'll think somehow, right, that the goal is to directly apply what's said to something that's going on like right now without any sort of thought or interpretation, and both those things are wrong. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to take a look at the Book of the Covenant to get an idea of the kind of people that God is attempting to form among the people of Israel. Okay? And here's a way to think about this. You may remember from reading the Gospel of Matthew that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins by taking some provisions of the 10 words, and then he interprets them. So let me give you an example of how this works. This is Matthew 5:38 and following. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." We're actually going to look at that provision this morning. So that's what Torah said. "But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go to 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. So Jesus sort of takes what he believes is the statement in Torah, and then he kind of interprets its intention and kind of pushes it forward. So as we go through the Book of the Covenant, parts of it, we just want to be thinking about what is this aiming at? What's God doing, okay, in this context? So the first provision I want to take a look at, it's Exodus 21, 1 through 11. This is a body of Torah concerning slavery, but the key portion is this, Exodus 21, 2. "When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing." Now that may not strike us as very revolutionary, but we have to put it in the context, right? Notice what Torah is doing here. Two things that are really important. Thing number one, it's acknowledging that there's an institution in the ancient world that we know today as slavery. It was rather different than the slavery we had in the American South, but I don't have time to explain that. But notice what it does. It makes 2 essential modifications on that institution. First, slavery is not envisioned as being a lifelong status. If you have a slave, at the end of 7 years, they go free. No questions. And they don't have to buy their freedom either. 7 years and their period of slavery is done. Whatever the master thinks or says. Because this is God's Torah. Also notice here, there's no hint whatsoever that slavery is sort of a situation or a status that kind of belongs to people who are sort of like inferior. Okay? People always say, well, people in the American South use the Old Testament to argue for slavery, but you know what? This is one of the passages they conveniently passed over. Okay? Here's a really important point. Something is not biblical simply because it's mentioned in the Bible. Okay? To find out whether something's biblical, you have to kind of dig into the Bible and kind of see if there's like a consistent teaching about something. Okay? The same thing is true here, and I've tried to make this point over and over. The same thing is true here essentially with polygamy. Polygamy is acknowledged, but it's implicitly regarded as something that is wrong. So let's follow the trajectory of slavery here into the New Testament and see what happens. Many of you, I'm sure, have read Paul's letter to Philemon, right? Philemon is addressed to Philemon, who's the owner of Onesimus. Onesimus is a slave who has run away, has found Paul, and Paul's writing Philemon to take Onesimus back. And in the process of this letter, right, Paul does something or says something to Philemon that would have been absolutely unthinkable in the Roman context. Paul tells Philemon to receive his escaped slave back as a brother. I'm sending him back to you, and you will receive him as a brother. This gives us a sense, right, of the trajectory of how much the institution of slavery has been modified and changed. So I think that's a really important provision. Second thing we want to take a quick look at is this. This is Exodus 21, 18 through 36. This places a limit on retribution. And once again, this may not sound revolutionary. It's the passage that Jesus refers to in the Sermon on the Mount, particularly Exodus 21, 23 to 24. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And once again, that may not sound like revolutionary or really wonderful, but actually it is. So, right, this is a culture where, let's say, Diane and I are part of the same family, and Justin Hughes sitting over here. Justin kind of has like a pretty bad temper. And one day, Justin throws a brick through Diane's living room window. And so Diane and I get together with all our family members, and what we do is we throw bricks through all of Justin's windows. And then Justin gets mad at us and sets a fire in Diane's front yard. And so Diane and I get together and we set Justin's house on fire. And it just kind of spirals on from there, okay? That is, the idea here is that people find themselves living in an ever-growing sort of cycle of violent retribution. What this provision does is it says, look, Justin threw a brick through Diane's living room window. Diane can throw a brick through Justin's living room window, but that's all she can do. She can't burn his house down. She can't light a fire in his front yard. Can't do anything like that. She's kind of disappointed, but that's what God's told her to do, so that's the way it's going to be. So we have limits placed on retribution, and notice what that passage that I read to you a few minutes ago, Jesus teaches us, right, you have to give up retribution completely. So once again, we get a sense here about the kind of society that God is attempting to form. Now, another part of the Book of the Covenant is also really interesting is Exodus 22, 21 to 27. I'll read it to you because I think it's really important. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat a widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people who is among you who is poor, you shall not do like a moneylender to him. You shall not exact interest from him. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. And what else, in what else shall he sleep? And if he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am compassionate. Now, this introduces another really important principle that is really, we really want to take seriously, and this will show up later on in the Old Testament prophets. One of the things that God's attempting to do here is he's attempting to create a people who measure the society that they live in by how well it treats those who are most vulnerable in it. Okay, and this is the list of the most vulnerable people in the ancient world. The sojourner, okay, someone from another country who's in your country. A widow who doesn't have a husband to protect her. And an orphan child who doesn't have parents to protect them. Okay? These people were the weakest people in the ancient world. They were the people who were most preyed upon by all kinds of people, seeking to take advantage of them. And God says, look, I know that everybody else is doing this, but this isn't going to be the way it is with you. Because, remember what happened to you in the land of Egypt. You were weak. You were in the most powerful nation in the world, and do you remember what happened to you? You got taken advantage of again and again and again and again and again. So when you settle in the promised land, I want you to remember that. And so, my people, one of the ways that I'm going to measure your society, one of the ways I'm going to measure you as my covenant people is how well you treat the most vulnerable people in your midst. The prophets will later come back and have a great deal to say about this. And once again, we just want to remember something really important. Within Judaism, and this would have included, of course, Jesus and Paul, right? The idea was that the Bible was divided into three major sections. The Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The prophets, which actually includes what we would sometimes call the historical books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, but also Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then the writings, things like Psalms and Proverbs. The idea is that the most important part of the Bible is the first 5 books. And the prophets actually hold Israel accountable to what's taught in the first 5 books. They're not making stuff up. Okay, so it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. So we have a society now that's also going to be shaped by how well it treats the most vulnerable people. Also, another important provision is Exodus 23, verses 1 through 9. This has to deal with how you deal with sort of, inequities of power in a society. And so here's part of it. This is Exodus 23, 2. You shall not fall in with the many who do evil. Nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. You shall not pervert justice due to the poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. So once again, there's this idea, well, look, once again, right, in other societies around the people of Israel, right, basically what happens is the powerful get their way. In one way or another, right? They either take what they want, or if the case goes to court, right, guess what they do? They pass out bribes. One of my favorite stories from American history, right, is back in the 19th century, the great railroad magnate Jay Gould shows up in Albany and literally bribes the whole New York legislature to give him a right-of-way for his railroad. He bought off every member of the New York State. Some, of course, would say this hasn't really changed all that much, but that's another issue. Notice what's being said here. And here we might want to think about the story of Nabos Vineyard. Remember what happens? This is a story of this one king, right? Remember, who becomes king of Israel. He's the king of the northern kingdom. And he really wants this vineyard that's owned by a guy by the name of Naboth. And his wife, Jezebel, who's a Phoenician princess, says to him, hey, look, where I come from, when the king wants something, he just takes it. Why aren't you doing that? And the king has to explain to, well, this is Israel, and we kind of like do things differently here. Kings just can't take stuff. We're responsible to God, and God's given this Torah which governs inequities of power. I just can't take Nabos Vineyard. And so Jezebel says, okay, leave this to me. And so to shorten the story, remember what she does? She puts it out that she's heard Naboth blaspheme God. And a group of people show up and they stone Naboth to death, and they take the vineyard. This is an example of this being violated. Okay, this is an example of actually this being violated. So I think what we're getting a picture, right, of the society that God's trying to establish. It's a society where it's possible for all people to flourish, right? It's stable, it's ordered. There's a sense of mutual responsibility among people. That's the kind of covenant society that God's seeking to create. Now, the last part of the book of the covenant deals with something else, and I think this is equally important, and we don't want to pass over it. In Exodus 23:12, God gives the people of Israel a list of feasts and festivals that they're to celebrate. And here we want to think about, something, this is Israel's equivalent of the church year. Pentecost, Easter, Epiphany, things like that, right? Major feasts of the Christian year. Israel is given her own set of feasts. I just want to say something a little bit about that. Exodus 23:12, we come back to the Sabbath. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. That is, notice here, the Sabbath applies to everyone and everything within Israel, even if they're not Israelite. Animals get a rest, people get a rest. We'll see later on that actually the land gets a rest. The land's actually given a sabbatical too. And then there's even a greater sabbatical beyond that, the year of Jubilee, which we'll take a look at later on. So notice here once again, this sort of makes Israel a very different kind of society, right? This is a world where people work sun up, sundown, 7 days a week. And now the people of Israel are set apart because they have this day of rest, which is to be set aside. And as I tried to say last time, right? One of the things that's going on in the Sabbath is an act of trust in God, right? You're stopping work and you're saying, in effect, right, you know what? I believe that there's more going on in the world than simply my work. There's God, he's the creator, and he's good. And therefore, if I don't work today, things are not just going to collapse, because there's more involved in this world than frantic human activity, which is a really good thing, right? If the only thing that we're working in the world were frantic human activity, we'd all be kind of like up the creek without a paddle, right? This is also saying something really important too, and I wish we had time to go into it, but we don't. So I'll just be very brief about it. This is also a statement about work. So work is important. It gives people meaningful things to do. It enables them to use their talent and their ability. But, and this is a really big but, work is not the measure of the meaning of human life. Work is not the measure of the meaning of human life. People have a value beyond their work because they're created by God. So God institutes several feasts here. He institutes the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is eventually transformed into the Passover. He institutes the Feast of Harvest, which eventually becomes what we know now today as Pentecost. and he institutes the Feast of Ingathering, which becomes the Feast of Booths. And then in 23:17, 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. That is, what happens here is these are the pilgrimage feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Booths. And at those feasts, the only place that you can celebrate them is in Jerusalem. So wherever you live, if you're a Jewish male, you want to celebrate these feasts, you have to leave wherever you are and you have to go to Jerusalem. And the idea behind this is this, right? You're going to say, but that would like interrupt people's schedules, right? In order to travel to Jerusalem, even if you were living in Israel, right? You have to interrupt your schedule, you have to pack a bunch of stuff up, and you have to go to Jerusalem to celebrate this feast. And wouldn't that like interrupt people's schedules? And the answer is yes, and that's part of its purpose, right? By interrupting our schedule, right, God's doing something really, really important. He's building in ways that we can orient our lives toward Him, okay? Now, I know that none of you here thinks this because you're also advanced and spiritual. But, I've heard people say, gosh, I just don't like going to church because it's just like, it's a real time suck. By the time you get out, the morning's over and, think of all the things you could have done and, da-da-da-da-da. And I want to say, actually, you know what? One of the purposes of Sunday morning is it's supposed to interrupt our schedule. Right? It's supposed to kind of push a hole into our schedule and remind ourselves, you know what? The purpose of life isn't just simply like doing things that we need to get done. Okay, whether that's cutting the grass or repainting the living room or whatever. It really is important to have that time, right, where we say, you know what? My time and my life really don't belong to me. They belong to God. One of my favorite theologians, his name is Robert Jensen, says that one of the reasons why God can order time like this with the Sabbath and feasts is because he says, God literally has all the time in the world because he created it. Right? So we can think of time in one of two ways. Time is essentially an empty space that we fill with what we think is important. Or, time is the gift that God's given to us to accomplish his purposes. You can look at time in one of those two ways. Either way, it's going to have a huge effect on the way that we live. Okay, let's take a quick look at 24. 24 is a really, really important chapter in the Old Testament because this is the confirmation, the sealing of the covenant. And here we just want to note, right, that every covenant in the Old Testament is sealed with a sacrifice. And the New Testament will be no exception, right? The new covenant is sealed in the upper room, right, where Jesus says, this is my body which is broken for you. This is the new covenant in my blood which is poured out for you. Okay, so the idea of sealing a covenant with a sacrifice extends all the way into the New Testament. Let me just read to you part of this narrative because there are a whole bunch of important things that are going on here. So the people of Israel at Mount Sinai, and God says the book of the covenant is read to the people of Israel, and they say, I do. Okay, they agree to it. And here's what happens. Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Moses told the people all the words that the Lord and all the rules, and the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So here's Israel's covenant marriage vow, in effect, right? Yes, we've just heard everything God wants from us, and we agree. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, and listen to this very, very carefully, this is what Moses says as he sprinkles this blood on the people. Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. That should sound relatively familiar. The blood of the covenant the Lord has made. So what's happening here? Well, two things. We have, as I said, Moses reading the book of the covenant to people. They're being reminded of what their marriage vow is to God, and they all say, I do. And then there's a sacrifice. Two sacrifices in particular, which we'll be talking about in extensive detail when we get into Leviticus. Burnt offerings and peace offerings. And what happens is that Moses has these animals slaughtered. The blood's drained out. And some of the blood is dashed against an altar. And then some of the blood is actually sprinkled on the people. We're going to try and reenact this next Sunday, by the way. So come prepared. Now, I think it's really important to understand what's going on here. What's the significance of all this? And I think that it's important to kind of not get kind of grossed out by having blood spattered on you to see what's going on here, because it's hugely important. There are two dimensions here of Israel's worship. One is the dimension of what we might call word, the book of the covenant being read. Of course, we still have this today, right? Every celebration of the Eucharist involves the reading of Scripture, the book of the covenant. Okay, so we're still doing it today. And then this sacrificial blood is now sprinkled on the people of Israel. So just remember this, right? These are animals that have been sacrificed to God. I'll say something about sacrifice in a minute. And that means that now, right, the animals have been given to God, and the blood from those animals now is being sprinkled on you. What's going on? Well, I think the answer is something like this. Here at the Mount Sinai, the people of Israel literally become God's blood relations. The people of Israel have been adopted into the family of God. Okay? So this moment is enormously important. Once again, it helps us understand what's going on with the giving of Torah. It's not just law, right? It's God is adopting these people. He's creating a familial bond with them. They're now his people, and he's giving them teaching, instruction, wisdom in terms of how they are to represent him and be his people in the world. So what happens here at Mount Sinai is of enormous importance. And then this is really interesting. It's 24:9 and following. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. So Moses and Aaron, Aaron's the high priest, Nadab and Abihu are Aaron's sons, they're priests too. So Moses and these three priests and the 70 elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel, and they beheld God and ate and drank. The sealing of the covenant on Mount Sinai culminates with Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel all entering into the presence of God and having a meal. Now, the question here is, well, where did the meal come from, right? Who provided it? And the answer is pretty clear. Way back in 24:5, we have a mention of peace offerings. So a peace offering, as we'll talk about this in much more detail when we get to Leviticus, but a peace offering was one of the offerings that God gives to his people, and what it involves is this. You take an animal, you kill it, you drain the blood out, and then you put the animal on a kind of, it's called the altar of burnt offering. It's kind of like a giant barbecue pit. essentially. And what you do is, for a peace offering, you combust part of the animal on the barbecue pit. It's kind of like when I cook out. You end up with a burnt offering. Another part of the animal is cooked, and the people offering the sacrifice eat the offering. The idea being that having eaten something that was offered to God, this creates a bond between the people eating the meal and God. Now, I'm emphasizing this a lot because what I'm wanting you to see, what I'm hoping you'll see is, here we have, in effect, the Old Testament prefiguration of what we know now as the Eucharist. A meal which is eaten together by God's people, which creates a bond among them and a bond with God. It's taking place here at Mount Sinai. So this is the conclusion, or the sealing of the covenant. So I want to say a quick word about sacrifice, and then we'll stop. I'll be saying more about it later, but it's such an important topic. I'll be emphasizing it again and again. So sacrifice plays an essential role both in the Old Testament and also in the New. We'll focus on the Old right now because that's where we are. So just a couple of brief points. I just want to mention here, whole books have been written on sacrifice in the Old Testament, so I can't give you a book, okay? If I did that, that would be like my first miracle, and then I'd go and walk on the water in the retention pond out front, or turn water into wine or something. I can't do that. So we just want to remember a couple things here. First, when you think about sacrifice in the Old Testament, make sure that you think about it with quotation marks, okay? I'm sure we all have images of what sacrifice is in our minds, right? From television or movies or whatever, and we normally think of it like this, right? Sacrifice means that people take like things that are valuable to them, an animal, wine, grain, and they then offer that to some god. And the purpose of the sacrifice, right, is to get that god to kind of like you. Okay, it's kind of like a bribe in effect, right? So I'm trying to get some god to be favorable to me. You know, I have my 30 oxen lined up, and I say, look, God, you know, these are my 30 prize oxen. I'm going to sacrifice them to you because this is how much I think of you, and so I've just sacrificed them to you. Now that I've sacrificed these 30 oxen, let's have a little conversation about a couple things I'd like you to do. That's not this, okay? So the thing to remember here as we talk about sacrifice in the Old Testament, right, is really important thing. God's the creator, right? Everything that exists has come from God. So that raises the question, right? What could any human being possibly give to the creator? And the answer to that question is not a blessed thing. Okay? So in the Old Testament, sacrifice has no connotation or no meaning of offering something to God with the idea that you're going to get something from him. Because he doesn't need anything. And everything belongs to him already. So it's not going to do you any good. So what is sacrifice for? Well, the sacrifices all have kind of like different roles. So let me give you an example, a real quick example that I think will make the point. Let's go back to our burnt offering. In a burnt offering, right, you take an animal, whatever it is, you put it on the altar of burnt offering, and the whole darn thing, the whole animal is combusted on the altar, kind of a giant, kind of radical barbecue, in effect. Now, what's going on there? Well, it seems to be this. By offering the animal whole and entire to God, you're not giving God anything. You're not trying to convince God to do anything. Actually, what's really happening is the animal that you're giving is a visible sign of your offering your whole self to God, right? So every time I offer a burnt offering, what I'm really doing is I'm reminding myself of something that I need to do. I need to offer myself as an offering to God. Now, I've got a little theory, and it may be semi-crazy, like, you know, a lot of my theories that you've probably heard and are tired of hearing about. But I'll just share it with you, and you know, you can you can go home and say, well, you know, Michael Petty gave another one of his crackpot theories today, so what else is new? I think that Paul's actually thinking about the burnt offering in Romans 12, 1 through 2. Let me read it to you. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. That is, Paul's saying here, look, what is your offering to God? Is it the check that you write, or is it, when you volunteer at the Elder Guild? Well, partially. But your real offering to God is you. Okay? You are your offering. And that's the point the burnt offering's making. Paul's underlining it right here. So we'll actually spend a lot more time going through sacrifices because preview of things to come. The first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus are all about sacrifices. And what I'm going to do to make this really interesting is we're going to reenact all 7 of them. Okay, so I'll have like object lessons for each sacrifice, and then we'll do the sprinkle the blood thing and that kind of thing. And so it'll be really interesting. But what we'll do next time is we're going to see that things go really, really wrong. What happens is that beginning in 25, we're going to get instructions for building a thing called the tabernacle, God's visible dwelling among the people of Israel. And then we learn that as the first commandment effectively was being given at the top of Mount Sinai, it was being broken at the bottom because the Golden Calf Committee was in session. And they'd already begun a capital campaign to build the golden calf, and we'll see what happens as a result of all that. All right, we better get moving here.